Welcome to Women in STEM, the podcast that talks to women involved in science, technology, engineering, mathematics and medicine. For our first episode, I thought I'd sit down and have a chat with a long-time friend of mine, Dr. Melanie Thomson. I think the best way to describe Mel is as a scientist provocateur. A gastro microbiologist by training, Mel has also delved into the worlds of science communication, crowdfunding, and generally being an advocate for a better, more equal science. What made you interested in science?
What made me interested in science? Well, I grew up on a farm and I spent a lot of time in the outdoors with my animals, and I had a love of the natural world, and I was quite a curious and observant child, so I spent a lot of time watching the way, the grass grew and the seasons change, and, the birth and death cycle with the horses and the cows, and they used to come out and shoot the cows in the paddock and take them and butcher them and bring them back in, pieces for the freezer and,
So
nice rug.
the old idyllic country life.
Yeah, it was. It was completely, hobby farmer, idyllic country life. And that was great, and I went to a small rural school in Macclesfield in Victoria. It only had 150 kids, and sort of pottering away through school, I was very good at maths. And then in grade 5, we had a teacher called Mr. Vandenberg, Paul Vandenberg, his name was, and he was completely focused on maths and science. Now, he used to occasionally have to make us do English essays and stuff, or, write stories for English, but most of the time, totally focused on science and getting me to do a science experiment. And I absolutely vividly remember the very first science experiment that I ever remember doing was in his class. And it was basically lowering the freezing temperature of water using salt. And having a piece of cotton laying over the top of an ice cube, then sprinkling some ice on it, and then getting the piece of cotton then fusing to the ice cube because it had dropped the temperature by a couple of degrees. And I was just like, oh my God, wow. That is just like the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And then, and looking at the boiling temperature lowering as well with salt. And so that was the very first experiment that I ever recall doing. Thinking it was an actual experiment. They might have sent some other things as well, but I really don't remember anything before that. And from that point on, I wanted to be a scientist. And so from the age of 11, pretty much, I was committed to becoming a scientist. And here I am today, still a scientist.
Very cool. So what made you, you discovered you loved science, you wanted to do more science. What made you decide to go into gastromicrobiology?
Okay, so that was a bit of a longer journey. I think when I was at school, in secondary school, I was just around about the time when the genomic revolution started happening, back in the sort of early 90s, where they started to talk about this concept of genetics and being able to manipulate genes. And I remember distinctly my attention being captured by the scientists trying to create the blue rose, and that was it. I wanted to be a horticulturalist that was going to invent the blue rose. And I think I watched some hideously awful Cinderella remake at some point called The Blue Rose, I think, and that that whole princess complex thing that they try and indoctrinate girls with. I think there was some sort of crossover there between the awful telly movie called The Blue Rose and my ambition to become a horticulturalist geneticist. I was lucky in the fact that I managed to get work experience at the Horticultural Research Centre. That it was in Ferntree Gully at that time in Melbourne. And for the first 3 days, they had me weeding all of the greenhouses. So that was, not great. But I remember then on one of the days I got to actually write in one of the scientist's lab books because he was weighing some specimens. He was basically testing how much water some of the cut flower specimens that he was studying for his research was taking up. And he got me basically to sit there at his lab bench while he did all the weighing and actually record in his lab book the weights of the each of the specimens, and I was just like, oh wow, this is so cool. So at that point, I was like, awesome. I'm going to do this at uni. And so I enrolled in Melbourne Uni. I originally enrolled in art science because I actually was just as interested in history and politics as I was in science at that point. But I didn't quite get the marks to get the score to get into art science, so I didn't take my chances. I basically went and changed my preferences into straight science because I knew I was safely in for that at Melbourne Uni, and so I ended up starting straight science. At Melbourne Uni, the Melbourne model is to do, well, it was at that time and I think still is to do sort of generic first-year courses so that they bring you up to the speed and the level that they want you to be at before you then enter the sort of specialist years of second and third year. And I remember taking botany subjects within the biology course and absolutely hating it. Absolutely hating it. I'm like, oh my God, my dreams have just come crashing down around my ears because I am not interested in this at all. And so it was, what am I going to do in second year? I'm like, well, I'll still keep doing, molecular biology. I'm still really interested in genetics and genetic manipulation. And we've got a genetics department here. We've got a biochemistry department here. And what am I going to do to fill in my timetable? I know, I'll do microbiology to fill in my timetable because the 3 buildings were next to each other, so it was a quick walk. And so I started doing microbiology basically to fill in my timetable in second year. And as soon as I started microbiology, I just went, oh, yes, now we're talking. It was the sort of us and them, good versus bad kind of really simplistic. There was a clear cut good and bad in microbiology. It's now that I've continued on to be a microbiologist, it's not quite as clear cut as that. But second year university, you're still in your 20s and you're still thinking about things in sort of simplistic terms. And so I was absolutely loved microbiology and had some fabulous teaching scholars and practical demonstrators, and I think I would thank Cheryl Powers, who's still at Melbourne Uni, still teaching in the micro department, now in the beautiful Pete Doherty Institute, who was an amazing woman who inspired me to basically stay in the micro lab. And so I stayed there and did my honours in rotavirus research with Barbara Coulson. And then by that stage, I'd been overseas on my gap year and I'd fallen in love at that stage. And so I'd left Melbourne Uni after my honours and moved to London. And then proceeded to work in the UK for 12 years, which included doing my master's and my PhD at the University of York and doing a short postdoctoral period at the Leeds Institute of Molecular Medicine. And I worked on Helicobacter pylori and the interactions with the ion metabolism system there for a very short 20-month postdoc before I applied for a fixed-term 3-year position at the Deakin Medical School to be a lecturer in molecular medicine, and that's where I am still today.
So you worked overseas quite extensively. How would you sort of compare the two systems?
Yeah, so obviously working somewhere like the UK, it's got a large depth to there's definitely a lot more depth to the industry because it's bigger. There's a lot more universities, there's a lot more opportunities, and there's also private sector that's attached to the biomedical research fraternity in the UK, and that's something we really lack here in Australia. And I know that there's several moves afoot under the innovation ideas boom agenda to try and get the industry in this country to develop to the point that you can actually go between the private sector and the academic sector. Whereas at the moment in Australia, it's a little bit more provincial, a little bit underdeveloped. It's more of a cottage industry if you want to go into to the private sector, and you may not be necessarily able to come back easily because of the restrictions on track record that happen when you've been out in industry and then coming back again to try and get an academic position. And with the increasing funding restrictions, it's becoming more and more crystallised to the fact that you actually need to have an amazing track record. You don't need just a fair to middling track record. You need an amazing track record to stay competitive, to get funding to do your work.
That could lead to some problems with, say, early researchers or even mid-level researchers, couldn't it?
Yes, it definitely is, and it's something that is recognised and they're trying to do something about. They haven't really moved on past the hand-wringing stage at this point to develop any measures that we're going to address this problem. They tend to make suggestions on please put in submissions to our stakeholder engagement exercise and tell us what you think we should do, because we don't know what we should do, because we've been doing the same thing for sort of the last 30, 40 years, and in fact it's the same people getting the money as the last 30 to 40 years in some of the cases. And so it has got to the point where there is this big lockout of early and mid-career researchers that aren't already attached to sort of one of these super rock star kind of labs, or haven't been over to a postdoc in a rock star lab, say at MIT or Harvard, and then come back to start their own labs at somewhere like WeHi. If you haven't done that model, and you've done what I've done, which is go to basically work overseas based on geographic practicalities for where I was living in the UK, as opposed to going to Oxford or Cambridge, which would have, maybe given me a better experience and a better track record. But then I've come back to a non-G of 8 university in Australia, in a regional area. And so again, there's not many people in my department that actually get big grants. And so it can be a bit isolating. Like, I'm the only medical bacteriologist at my university, which has been incredibly isolating for the last 5 years, and has meant that I've had to spend a lot of time reaching out to other like-minded colleagues at other universities and finding some that will actually take a chance on me and help me out and support me with giving me their patronage. And I've been lucky that I've found some of those people prepared to help. But it's been a long struggle.
So networking has been very important.
Oh, career. Absolutely. I mean, you couldn't do what we do without networking, and I try to instill that in my students. And it's interesting that my undergraduate students that I've lectured for the last 3 years, they are self-starting networkers that will go to breakfast meetings on Swapback for the BioMelbourne Network and ASMR careers evenings. But my PhD students, not interested, even though I have, clearly demonstrated to them that they need to do that and for their careers, but they're just not interested in doing that. And so it's a bit disappointing, because I worry that they're limiting their options when they finish.
I wonder if that's a factor of the rise of social media.
It could be.
I mean, just to throw something out of left field, younger people are more likely to be on social media. They understand networking as an integral thing.
Well, I don't know if they understand that the difference between professional networking and social networking. I mean, I'm well known for my Twitterati status, and I actually have managed to do a lot of professional networking on Twitter, in the fact that I've managed to become friends with people like Brian Schmidt and Doug Hilton from WeHi on Twitter before I've met them in person. And so that to me is using social media for networking, whereas talking to your mates that are in the next building about your dodgeball tournament that you're having, really to me is not networking. and particularly because I'm in a rural area and so are my students, and I say to them, Melbourne's not that far down the road, you really should occasionally go to these things X, Y, Z that we've got, and we put the posters up in the tea room. It's not like they don't know about them. They're just not interested in going because they don't seem to understand the necessity for it. And even if you can talk to them until you're blue in the face about it, but really, I don't know what more I can do to try and impress upon them that they should do it. Whereas my undergraduates that I've been brainwashing from the age of sort of 18, they seem to be a bit more receptive to the message.
Easier to get in there when you get them young, isn't it?
I think that must be it.
Now, you just haven't been professionally networking on social media. You've actually been doing, you're sort of a pioneer in Australia for medical research and crowdfunding.
Yes, I think that it's safe to say that I probably am one of the pioneers for that. I was probably the first person in Australia to do that with the Mighty Maggots campaign, and I've subsequently done 2 more campaigns since then. I'm no longer trying to crowdfund my research through that stream, but I am trying to now. I'm currently crowdfunding a community event for a careers night for a Women in Science Australia event at the Sydney Science Festival. So, it's definitely given me skills in other ways, and it's interesting to, again, I'm drawing the parallel between sort of private industry and what skills they require and the academic skills and what's recognised in academia as an achievement. And there's definitely a big dichotomy there where when I speak to people at industry networking events and tell them that, and say, oh no, we did this crowdfunding thing, I got sort of sort of from the room when I was in a group of, private sector biotechnologists.
Mm.
But when I was in my promotion interview, I just got heckled by my fellow professors. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword in the fact that it's seen as zany by the ivory tower and so not recognised as innovative. I mean, in fact, I'm looking at them now. I did get a couple of certificates saying that I was innovative for that effort, but it didn't actually translate into real rewards, and so it was quite disappointing in that way. But I know that several people I have mentored through crowdfunding campaigns have basically taken their skills that they've learnt and the fact that they have a demonstrated entrepreneurial track record now and have used that and leveraged that to get jobs in industry.
So you brought this up before, the difference between academic and industry in terms of outlooks, what they value.
Mm-hmm.
If you had what would be the perfect environment for you?
Well, I mean, as I say, in the UK and many of my sort of PhD student cohort from when I went through as a student and even as a master's student before I did my PhD, there was definitely about a 50-50 split of people that went into academia to do postdocs and then people that went straight into industry to do industry positions. And with all of these things, funding is tight in both areas and fluctuates in both areas. So you tend to get people, but in England you get people moving between the two and quite freely. And whereas in Australia it's a bit more difficult to do that because they're just there's just not that well-developed connection, and it's not valued. Both sides don't value the skills of the other, and so it's quite hard for an academic to demonstrate the skills that industry wants, unless of course they've done some crowdfunding, whereas things you learn in industry, perhaps, that you can't really demonstrate because you're not allowed to talk and publish about you're not allowed to talk about your work at conferences and you're not allowed to publish because you're under, confidentiality agreements. You can't then demonstrate that you've got that track record. You may have that track record, but you can't show it on paper. You can't look at your papers up on PubMed and count them. And academia is very obsessive with metrics and tends to want to see the scores on the doors for track record, and that's how they assess viability for grants. You must demonstrate a previously successful track record, preferably with no gaps in it, which is always hard for women who take time off or men that decide to have career breaks. So it's a bit of an issue, really.
Since we chatted, Dr. Thomson has announced that she is actually leaving Deakin for the wilds of the private sector. Needless to say, I don't think this is going to change her approach to life. Now, the music you heard for the intro and outro is a track called Provocatuer by Texas Radio Fish. This music is licensed Creative Commons attribution only. You can find it at dig.ccmixter.org. Well, that brings us to the end of our first episode. I do hope you've enjoyed it and it's been informative. If you want to know more about women in science in Australia, if you go to womeninscienceaust.org, you'll find more information about women who science. There is a lot of profiles, a lot of information, and if you want to get involved in events, I heartily recommend you go along. All right, until next time, thank you very much for listening.